introducing Father Hans. I don't know that Father Hans actually needs much introduction to many of you, but he was here last year about the same time, wasn't it, Hans? Yes. And so Father Hans is probably the preeminent expert on safeguarding in the Catholic Church in Australia. He is on a mission from God in the sense that he works across the world with episcopal conferences, with religious congregations, with councils, with Catholic entities and organisations, a Jesuit priest who is deeply committed to addressing the fundamental issues that underpin the notion of sexual abuse and its impact across the life trajectory of people who actually experience that. So he will tell you more about himself, I'm sure, but actually the Institute of Anthropology, Interdisciplinary Studies and
on
human dignity. There you go. I'll let him say it. In Rome, facilitating the International Safeguarding Conference. Very exciting theme this year. Perhaps Hans will be able to tell you a little bit more about that and the opportunity and the invitation for more people from Australia to actually participate in that conference. But please welcome Hans. Welcome everyone who's online. We record this and provide it to people afterwards. I think I have to turn the mic off because you're wired, aren't you?
Not yet.
Oh, not yet.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the warm welcome, Ursula and Richard. Thank you for all those who have organized this. It feels very much coming home. We've been here last year in the same room, and somebody mentioned that I really seem to love Australia because I come here every year. And I confirm that. I really love the country and I love the people here. Thank you for all those who are here in presence and the many people, I see 92 now, who are joining us online. And I've seen a lot of names that are familiar to me. I think we are here for something, as has been said, important, for something that is not the most obvious, as it seems to be, and for something that needs our engagement at different levels. So I would just invite us to enter into this day in the spirit of conversation, the spirit of a critical conversation. I'm not going to tell you what Rome says or what has to be taught in theology or what are the dogmatic solutions ex cathedra. I'd rather hope that we can continue the conversation that has started for many of us many years ago, and that this is a sort of, let me say, focalizing on one of the aspects that have to do with an issue that has been on our minds, in our hearts, in the media for many years in this country and elsewhere. And where our responsibility as human beings, as Christians, as members of the church, or as simple believers in something beyond our reach, in our spiritual journeys, have to acknowledge that humanity has failed many people. The church has failed victims of abuse in its midst. And by the church, I mean not only bishops and provincials, but also the people of God as a whole. Because we are either co-responsible and we are synodal in all, or we are not. So there are different levels of responsibility, yes, but it's up to us as a community of believers, searchers, to do whatever we can as a community so that people who have been hurt find solace, find wherever and however it is possible healing, and at least a listening ear, and that we provide the space and the relationships so that people can flourish and can grow. Yesterday, I was asked to give an interview by an Irish outlet. Probably I'll do it tomorrow because of the time difference. You may have seen the news that Pope Leo received the other day a victim of clergy sexual abuse in a Catholic school in Dublin. I think it's run, or used to be run, by the Spiritan Fathers, Black Rock. And this person was visibly very moved when, after the meeting, after the audience, the journalists interviewed him and he shared what he had experienced. And he quoted the Pope, as some other victims and associations of groups of victims have quoted him after meeting him recently. Ending Clergy Abuse, for example, in November, the Belgium group of survivors who saw him at the end of November, and now this Greg Ryan, if I'm not mistaken, or David Ryan, quoting him and saying that the most important moment was that the Pope was just listening and taking in the pain that this person shared with him and the pain of his late brother, who died a few years ago, who the two of them had been abused by clergy in that particular school. And the Pope has reminded the bishops, the new bishops, in September when he had met them at the end of their induction course. He reminded the cardinals at the end of the consistory on 8th of January this year, a month ago, not even, that we need to address safeguarding, we need to address the hurt and the pain of victims of abuse. We cannot put it aside, and we need to work on a church that is safer, more healing, and more prepared to take its own responsibility for the past, the present, and the future. Now, as I said, I don't want to give you here the impression that I can talk ex cathedra, so as the definitive solution or proclamation or explanation of theological issues. I'm a psychologist, a licensed psychotherapist, but my first vocation was as a theologian. Sometimes I also wish that somebody would invite me to talk about the doctoral topic of my dissertation in systematic theology, which was on the beautiful topic of spiritual consolation and the discernment rules of St. Ignatius. And that was way before we had a Jesuit Pope. So anyway, we'll come to consolation, I believe, because theology, of course, has, if it is Christian theology, if it is theology that is meaningful for human people, it needs to grow out of hope, faith, and love. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here, despite all our anger, all our disappointments, and all our failed or faulty expectations. So I'm a theologian also, and I have studied theology in Innsbruck for my first cycle, second cycle, and third cycle, with Jesuits who had a very close relationship to normal pastoral questions. So on one hand, I think the theology I was introduced to was really captivating me, my attention, and this link between my life, my search, and my quest for God, and my longing for some meaning in life was fulfilled in that study, because it was not an abstract thing. It connected to me, and it connected to my prayer, to my spiritual life. I do believe for many people today, that's a very difficult thing to find. The connection between what we proclaim, what we write, what we publish, what you can hear in sermons and whatever, and what is our own journey in life and in faith. Many people find it very difficult to connect the two things. And honestly, I believe that one of the reasons why there is this disconnect is that we don't face the real questions that are put in front of us. And we celebrate Mass, we do our little prayers, we go for retreats without really bringing into our prayer space, our spiritual space, whatever that is not only prayer, not only our liturgy, spirituality is much broader. We don't bring in the real questions. And one of those real questions is the reality of abuse committed by members of the church, clergy, non-clergy, denied by members of the church, clergy, non-clergy, avoided by members of the church, clergy and non-clergy. And as Ursula said, I say this also in view of my many travels and many meetings with people from all over the globe. Because I believe that this is not something particular to Australia or to Italy or wherever. This is something that is present everywhere. Some sense of not really owning, not in faith, not in prayer, and not in theology, the questions that are brought to us by victims of abuse, by their family members, friends, and so forth, and by our own reasoning and our own publications. I was very glad that with Dan Fleming and Jim Keenan, we started to organize something 2017, I believe, or 18. And it would have been, I believe, a landmark conference in which we tried to bring together mainly moral theologians from across the globe, about 100, just to really start a conversation on theology. I mean, academic theology, but facing the reality of abuse and all the questions connected, and there are many, as I will try to show. Unfortunately, after 2 years of hard work and preparation, we had to call it off because it was planned for right at the beginning of the pandemic. So we tried to have it later on online, etc. It fell through. We have published the acts of those prepared conferences and talks in English and in Spanish. So if you look for that, you can find it online, also as an e-publication. Anyway, unfortunately, I believe one kairos was lost, because the time was ripe. I think it was ready for some broader conversation in theology. It didn't happen, and as we have seen now after the pandemic, and with the world situation getting crazier and crazier day by day, economic failure all over the place, people's attention has moved on and hasn't stuck to our issues. And that is also true for theology. So we need to continue our journey with perseverance, and so that we can make it sustainable. Because this topic will not go away. the way how we deal with it needs to change. How do we change? We change by talking, by writing, by publishing, by convening conferences. But the change that we need is much deeper, and the change needs to come from the bottom of the heart. And I do believe we have, in this country and many others, the Catholic Church has done enormous efforts in terms of safeguarding, in terms of research, in terms of education, formation. No other institution and organization, if we look into the global situation, has done as much as the Catholic Church to make people more aware and more knowledgeable. No other institution has done as much. Certainly no other religion, certainly no other denomination. If we look into the global picture, I don't talk about Australia, I talk about what we see in the whole world. And I think that also needs to be said. We have done a lot. Not perfect, not all what we could, but we have done a lot. What we don't do easily is to come from the guidelines level, the policy level, the objective standards and criteria level, to an internalization, to an owning of what the reality of abuse and the necessity and the opportunity of safeguarding bring with them. It has remained largely, unfortunately, something, let me call it, superficial. Something you can brush off rather easily. You can sideline it again. So I do think it has not entered into the system as much as it should. And by system, I mean parishes, school, not only guidelines, but the way we conceptualize school, education, social work, spiritual retreat houses, etc. It is something added on still. It is not really in the system. So that you don't need to think twice, but it comes automatically to you. How do we create safe space, safe relationships in what we do? And I do think that this is due to the fact that we have missed out on spirituality and theology. Our theological faculties find it very difficult to confront themselves with these questions. There are individuals, there are chairs, there are sometimes conferences organized in major universities across the globe. But I haven't seen in no place a consistent engagement from the side of theology. I repeat, there are individuals who do that and there are chairs, but as a faculty, a department that would take on those questions, I haven't seen it. And for me, that is very telling, because that is the reason why it doesn't get to our heart. It is something you try to avoid still. While when we look at such an icon as this one, we could realize that this is the core of the gospel. What we talk about is the core of the gospel. I don't say that safeguarding is the only topic, but surely it is at the core of gospel message and our understanding of Jesus' mission. Jesus here, in this icon that was written, as they say, by a Ukrainian artist. And I had asked him, this icon is at the entrance of our office space in Rome. So when we enter and leave our office space in the Institute of Anthropology, we pass by. And this is the inspiration for what we want to do and who we want to be. So Jesus at the center, and this is traditional iconographic Byzantine motive of Jesus the healer and redeemer. And you see on your right, you see the leper who has been healed, the hemorrhaging woman, if you attended Mass yesterday, that was the gospel yesterday, and the paralytic. They have been healed. So those who have been sick, hurt, marginalized, cast out of society, Jesus reaches out to them. And then I asked him to put also into that traditional motive a mother and her 2 children, because of course children are, I would say, the most vulnerable of the vulnerable still. So Jesus, who is with these people, he reaches out. And as you know, in the icons, the golden backgrounds signifies healing and wholeness and hope and eternal redemption. So it is with this hope and with this image that I would like to ask us to remind when we go through that this is our inspiration. It's not about this theology or that theology. It's not about this author or that. It's not about this pope or another. Here is the source, and here is the goal, the aim of who we are. People who reach out according to Jesus' example to those who have been hurt, marginalized, kept out of sight, and those who need particular attention and protection. Those who need to flourish in our midst. So, as I go around, I still have to say that the topic is present everywhere, but as I said before, it's not really integrated. It's not really brought into our faculties, our schools, our parishes, etc. There is a surprising lack of sustainable engagement. Last year, when I was here, I heard about safeguarding fatigue among safeguarding personnel in the diocese and the religious congregations, etc. Safeguarding fatigue meaning I do what I can and it's never enough, and I don't have the support I need, and resources are cut, and personnel is not trained well, etc., etc. A few months later, actually, the day of the election of Pope Leo, I was in Florida at the meeting of the USCCB's safeguarding officers from the 200 dioceses in the US. And they were speaking the same language. And later on, the head of the US review board for all the dioceses spoke about complacency creeping in. Complacency. We do the job, but our heart is elsewhere. So I'm really worried about that, because it shows that we think it's over and we have done enough, and energy runs out, and so many things catch our attention. But where is the sustainability of this? And as I said before, that doesn't mean that we don't do, many of us do enormous amount of work in terms of safeguarding measures. And this is necessary. And it surely creates an atmosphere in many places in this world where people feel much safer now than in the church than before. And in countries like India or many places in Asia, where I've been also recently, we've had meetings in Tokyo, etc. The example of what the Catholic Church does is really passed on. It works by osmosis. So people take it on because they see a good example. It's not because we are particularly convincing theoretically or so, but because people see that this is important. But it is much more a grassroots movement and not a top-down thing. And the top-down thing is really lacking many places. I don't talk about Australia in particular, in many places in the world, because we are lacking engagement and consistency in our approach in dealing with the past. First and foremost, acknowledging the pain of the victims, their families, friends, colleagues, but surely also looking at the consequences at a structural, at a systemic level. I will come back to that later. Which doesn't mean that there is a one-size-fits-all approach. This is of biggest importance, I think, if you talk about the Catholic Church as a whole, and even for churches like the local church of Melbourne or Victoria, whatever diocese here in the country. In your diocese, in your parishes, you have people of different color, of different language, of different cultures. And I often wonder how much we are aware when we talk about these things that there are people in our midst who don't have the language. And even if they have the language, they don't understand what in English safeguarding or guidelines or whatever you have mean. And they have a completely different sense of what is safe. Yesterday I was at Anglesey, beautiful place, with the Tertians, the Jesuits in the latest stage of formation. And they came from Africa, Europe, other parts of in Asia. And I asked them, what do you in your culture perceive and in your context perceive as safe? Astonishing the difference. In South Sudan, there's a guy from South Sudan in that group. I mean, safety today in his context means building a wall around the school so that the soldiers in civil war can't enter. That is safeguarding there in this very moment. Another Jesuit is a Vietnamese by birth, but works since almost 20 years in Japan. So I asked him, I mean, coming from Vietnam, going to Japan, both Asian, both Confucian background, more or less, completely different sense of community responsibility, importance of rules and regulations, order. So if this is true for only that small part of the world in which we find ourselves here, how much more is it important to realize that there is no one size fits all if we talk about safeguarding? And I say it again, it's not only for Catholic Church globally, it's also locally, because in your communities you have people of different persuasions and different provenances. That's the reason Ursula mentioned it. We'll have the International Safeguarding Conference, 16 to 19 June this year in Rome at our Institute, Gregorian University, a conference precisely on that. Because I think that's an underestimated topic also in theology. So I do believe that we are at a new stage in life of humanity. The changes that we have seen over the last decade or so, and more also what we realize with the digital world and the importance of artificial intelligence, all this changes our mind and necessitates a reflection on what do we mean by the words that we use, that we are used to use, but have changed meaning over time. Because we don't have the same understanding of relationship that we had 50 years ago. We use the same term, of course, but how has digital conversation, communication changed our understanding of relationship? This is a slow, unnoticed process, but it is continuous. And it is not only for the youngsters, Generation Alpha or whatever. It's also for us from Stone Age, who haven't who haven't grown up with a gadget in their hand. Now imagine for those young people what it means, relationship. But only one example of why I think we need to really go to the basics and and ask a foundational question. Now, this isn't, as I said, I'm not pontificating here. I hope so. But at least let us quote some of the speeches of the popes. One is the great theologian Benedict. In his letter to the Catholics of Ireland, in the year that was supposed to be the year of the priest, but became the year known, at least in Central Europe, as the year of scandal, he wrote, "I wish to exhort all of you as God's people to reflect on the wounds inflicted on Christ's body, the sometimes painful remedies needed to bind and heal them, and the need for unity, charity, and mutual support in the long-term process of restoration and ecclesial renewal." This is 16 years ago by Pope Benedict. And you could go now word by word in the exegesis of this and find out what meaning is implied. First, he says, all of you. He doesn't address only the bishops. As God's people, to reflect on the wounds inflicted on Christ's body. He speaks about survivors of abuse, and he identifies their wounds with the wounds inflicted on Christ's body, the church. So he doesn't do anything else than Matthew 25:31, where Jesus identifies with the sick, the new, the in prison, etc. But I mean, this is very strong. He identifies the wounds of victims as the wounds inflicted on Christ's body, because the victims are in or represent also Christ's body. To reflect on the sometimes painful remedies needed to bind and heal, and the need for unity, charity, and mutual support. If there is one thing that sticks out for me over the last years, is the need to recreate communion. That's also something that has become quite difficult, not only at the large scale, but also in the parishes and in small faith groups and in whatever odd kind of ministry we find ourselves. And then he says a long-term process of restoration and ecclesial renewal. By the way, John Paul II said the same in other words. Francis said the same in other words. So restoration and renewal. For me, an image is God is knocking at our door. In Australia, for 40 years now, since the first big waves of interest in this topic have come about. In other parts of the world, much later. But God is knocking at the door of the church, of faculties of theology, of our families, and wants to be let in. And I don't know how much we listen to that knocking, because otherwise we would probably have started earlier to think about what does it really mean to restore spiritually, faithfully, our lives and the life of the people of God. So, if we talk about theology in an ecclesial culture, we need to ask the question of theological places, locus theologicus. So where do we find the place where theology starts? And how much is that the voices and the experiences of victims and secondary victims, safeguarding intuitions and our instinct of care? So how do we define safeguarding theologically? What does it mean to create or to participate in the creation of safe environment, safe relationships, and safe practices and processes? Safeguarding, as I have come to understand, even in English, is not a very clear term. I I think there's an advantage to that, insofar as you can define, if it's not clear-cut, you can define it yourself, at least to some extent. And I would propose that we define safeguarding as co-creation of safe environment, living out of safe relationships, and following safe processes and implementation of safe practices. So how does that translate into theology? Again, the voice of Leo in this case, when he met with the new bishops. As I said, he urged them to address promptly issues concerning inappropriate behavior by clergy. He literally said, they can't be swept under the carpet. They must be addressed with a sense of mercy and true justice towards the victims and the accused. So this is not even half a year ago when he met with the new bishops. He underlined, from his point of view, the necessity to address issues concerning inappropriate behavior by clergy with a sense of mercy and true justice towards victims and the accused. So let's come to some of the challenges according to the different subjects in theology. When I was preparing my final exam for a second cycle in dogmatic theology and systematic theology, the professor with whom I did the exam had the following procedure, that there were 12 topics in systematic theology. And you didn't need to go in detail in every one of the 12 and knowing every canon from every council or so. What he was more interested in was that you got the capacity to follow through with one theological question through all the other topics. So what does a certain image of God, of Trinity, because there are different schools to understand what Trinity means in theology, what does that mean for example, the understanding of the Eucharist, our redemption, our understanding of the church? So it was more of helping us to understand that in theology you cannot pick one thing and develop it on your own without considering the consequences for how you understand the rest of theology and the rest of faith. And in this sense, I would like to point out a few of those questions that have arisen in my reflection on theology in the face of abuse. And we start with Trinity. How do we understand the mysterious presence of God in the state of faith and of the church today? In a day and age where many people seem to forget about God, simply forget, they don't fight God anymore. It's just evaporating. It's just disappearing among our fingers. To what is God the Creator, Lord of the Church and of history and Comforter, calling us through the scandals and the crises of this time? If we believe that God is the Creator of all things, the Creator of humanity, if He's the Lord of history, if He is the Lord of His church, there's only one explanation why we are here today and why we ask such questions, because He wants something from us, as He wanted something from us, from humanity, when He called the people of Israel out in the desert. There was something they needed to find. And it doesn't make sense for me, theologically and psychologically, to deny that this is an important question, or to say we need to get over it. as long as we have not gone through it, we cannot get over it. And this is, the hard part is, it will cost us. It costs us something. It costs energy, nerves, dealing with our feelings and inner tensions, our anger, our fatigue, our hopes, and working through that so that we can get some glimpse of an answer. And I think we really don't take that seriously. We try to find an answer that is easily communicated, that you can present easily, but really entering into a process of which you don't know where it leads you to, as the people of Israel did not know where they will end up after 40 years. I think we need to let go of many things. And as we don't do it voluntarily and in a planned way, they are taken from us. Prestige, money, position, influence, security. I mean, many people in the church experience that. It's taken away without our consent, and we feel lost and we feel challenged. But we don't feel challenged because we take on the challenge, but we are forced to take it on because of the circumstances. So how could we own better the situation in which we are confronted with these challenges and say, okay, it's burdensome, it's hard, I don't understand, but let us try. I do believe that this has to do with the imagination and the conceptualization of the relationship between faith and the world. Where are we in this world? There are two extremes. You see it in the church. One, we are against the world and out of the world. And one, we are one with the world. This has been there since ever, since you can read it in the Bible. Interestingly, we are in the world, but we are not of the world. John, Gospel of John. So what does that mean today? How do we position ourselves in the front of all those challenges that are overwhelming? Politics, economy, communication. So where do we have the capacity as Christians to take a step back and look at this and then say, okay, we want to be there, or are we drawn into that? Anthropology, the theology of vulnerability. There are some attempts made recently, and Justin Glynn, just when we came here, told me that he's onto this. So we are very much looking forward, Justin. But what about a vulnerable theology? A theology that makes itself accessible also to non-academics and to people who are spiritually illiterate. How does that work? The theology of power and of powerlessness. Interestingly, I mean, here there are some eminent theological scholars here. They may correct me, but I have not found yet, in my research at least, I have not found yet a theology of power developed in a reasonable, in a acceptable way. Interestingly, because we talk about power all the time, we talk about the abuse of power as the root cause of all abuse. And we talk about how much power the Catholic Church as an institution has had, whatever. but a theology of abuse, how to think theologically as God as the power, as the source of all power, and our relationship vis-a-vis him. Theology of powerlessness, Jesus Christ on the cross, powerless, invested with most power. So how do we navigate those tensions that the faith, Christian images, gospel puts in front of us? You see, I have question marks here. After all those topics, I will have question marks. I don't have the answers. I just want to provoke you, to call you out, and at least for some of you, to go on thinking about that. The theology of childhood. I was asked a few 6, 7 years ago to publish on the theology of childhood. Again, there is no developed theology of childhood. I mean, of late there are some attempts, but interestingly, since until maybe 10 years ago, there was hardly anything as a theology of childhood in none of the Christian denominations, in none. Isn't that surprising for a religion that is based on the belief in a child that is born as Son of God? Isn't that interesting? Christology, soteriology. Where is God when innocent people are sexually or otherwise abused? God is with them, a victim of evil and wrongdoing as they are. Then again, Ratzinger, I quoted him as Pope here in one of his previous writings, when he spoke about the content of Christian salvation. So, I mean, soteriology, sorry, I didn't mention that. Soteriology means the theological thinking about how we are saved, how we are redeemed. Okay? So, Ratzinger says the content of Christian salvation is first salvation from sin. And this is where Western theology has got stuck. Western theology means Latin, means Catholic and Protestant. They have gotten stuck with the concept of salvation from sin. You have to get rid from sin. What is completely out of the picture for many, and let me say spiritually not really integrated, is the second meaning of salvation, receiving a new existence, sharing the fore-existence of Jesus. It's not only that I fight against sin, but I am called to a new existence. We read that in the readings, St. Paul, etc. But is that really something in front of our minds and faith, imagination, and spirituality? We have received a new existence. For many of us, that was probably something that we didn't think about a lot. Thirdly, of course, the resurrection from the dead. So as Jesus exists for, as he represents, so do we come to exist for and to represent with them. Jim Corkery, Jesuit who teaches at the Gregorian and an eminent Ratzinger scholar, has summarized that. Next theological topic, ecclesiology, the thinking about the church in theological terms. So the discussion about the church of the sinners or sinner church, a sinning church. Again, the theology of power and the question of synodality that has been introduced so powerfully by Francis, and Leo continues in that reflection. What theological lines do we need to develop to really reflect the learnings from the abuse scandals and the lack of accountability that we have witnessed over and over again in every place. What does that mean for the structure, for the relationship between the different bodies in the church? What does it say about priesthood, about bishophood? What does it say about the communion of bishops' conferences? How is the relationship between the local, the structured church in terms of the diocese and religious congregations and movements? Theologically, how does that work? Not only living side by side. Thank you. No, it's good. Air conditioning is broken, so I see that the sweating is not because of my words. But, and I have to say, I like it warm because where I come from, it was rather cold. Yeah, so pneumatology. Pneumatology is thinking about the Holy Spirit. Pneuma, Holy Spirit, the Spirit. So the Holy Spirit is called in John and elsewhere the Comforter. How can we think theologically about the Comforter in the process of meeting victims of abuse? How is the Comforter present in the lives of victims, secondary victims? How does the Spirit accompany the processes of reconciliation wherever that's possible? Sacramentology, think about the 7 sacraments. As I said, how do we understand the sacrament of order, ordination, diaconate, priesthood, bishop? You have had in this country during the Royal Commission a very accelerated discussion about the seal of confession. And it has continued in other places. The anointing of the sick. I have been asked by victims of abuse to administer this sacrament of anointing them because they expressed, this particular person expressed the wish and the request to be anointed because he or she felt like I need healing also through this type of sacrament. Eschatology, the thinking about the end of the days, eternity. So what about the final judgment, the encounter between the victim and the perpetrator? And the question of eternal punishment versus divine mercy. As you have seen, Pope Leo has put the finger on that. Mercy and justice. Biblical theology. God's and Jesus' closeness and identification with the wounded, as I've already spoken about. Fundamental theology. What, many times, I mean, this is now a little back, but 10, 15 years ago, there was a lot of questioning about what are the specifics of the abuse that happens in the Catholic Church. Is there something specific about that? Now it's gone beyond that. Also because we have realized, not least because of the results of the Royal Commission, that's not a Catholic privilege to abuse. In all religions, in all denominations, you have abuse. But what could we ask? What is the specific of abuse in a religious context, in a spiritual belonging? What about the relationship of the church with external authorities, police, media? How do we develop further theological and spiritual language? Moral theology, the big elephant in the room, sexuality. Of course, there are elements of Catholic teaching on sexuality that influence the specific reality of abuse committed by clergy. Sure. We have seen over and over again that celibacy does not lead to abuse. In all the reports, including the Royal Commission report, it is stated that celibacy as such does not lead to abuse. In all the places, in all reports, this is stated over and over again. However, how does celibacy, if it is not really accepted and integrated, play out over time so that it becomes a risk factor? Acknowledging the fact that from all what we know, the average age of a first-time offending Catholic priest, celibate Catholic priest, is of 39 years, not of 25, not even of 35. The average age is 39 to 40. So it's not celibacy as such. As we have also seen in Germany 2 years ago when a report into the Lutheran Church was published, and the proportion, the prevalence rates of male married pastors in the Lutheran Church in Germany were exactly the same as in the Catholic Church. And by the way, 50% of that abusers abused boys. Married male pastors in the Lutheran Church in Germany. So some of the concepts that run around in media need to be questioned. Mercy for victims and for perpetrators. The quote I had from Pope Leo, you remember, said, justice and mercy for victims and the accused. And I was surprised when I read it that in the aftermath of that, there was not as much backlash as I had expected, because he put purposely that and there. He's a man of the and. He's a man of the union, of communion, and he wants to bind things together. So mercy and justice for victims and the accused. And I think it's high time that we also talk about how we deal with perpetrators, because just kicking them out, as they say, defrocking them, doesn't solve problems on the safeguarding side. I don't say that there shouldn't be a dismissal, but not without follow-up and safety plans. So what about justice and forgiveness on that side? Again, question marks. Pastoral theology, the care for victims, secondary victims, care for perpetrators, care for communities. For example, how often has it happened that in broken communities, parishes where there have been perpetrators, active ministers, schools, whatever context, where have dioceses and religious congregations, orders really engaged in the healing process of those communities? While we know that almost inevitably there is a split and very often a split that can't be healed anymore between those who believe that this priest was a perpetrator and those who sustain that he wasn't. How often have we seen that? So, and very often communities are broken after that. And where is the engagement? How we can work through it. There is no magical solution. There won't be something that will bring peace in such situations. It is hard work. I think it would be worthwhile, because then you would see the light at the end of the tunnel. Liturgical theology. For many victims, it's impossible to enter churches anymore to attend liturgies because of symbols, gestures, words. What are the abusive spiritualities? Spiritual abuse, abuse of conscience. What about spiritual direction, accompaniment? So the word of spiritual abuse is the buzzword at the moment, to the extent that the Dicastery for Doctrine a year ago established a working group on the definition of what is spiritual abuse in church terms and in canonical terms. We haven't heard back from them. And I think it will be very difficult to define objectively spiritual abuse, because each one perceives things differently. For example, in confession or in homilies or in spiritual direction. I could say to something, you pray 3 Our Fathers, and the person would feel harassed. And others would take it in their own stride. So how do we find out what spiritual abuse is? We know that it exists, and we know that there are inherently abusive spiritualities, and we know that there are inherently abusive communities where, for example, members are not allowed to choose anything in their own will and right. We know that, and we can describe it post factum, after we have seen that. But it's very difficult from the outset to quantify. Then there's one thing that always brings audiences to a halt and to a silence that is very, very deep. I'll try it also here now. When have you last prayed personally and in liturgy for victims of abuse and for those who care for them and for those who have to deal with all the measures and the legal side, the canonical side? When did you pray for them for the last time? Normally there is dead silence. Isn't that interesting? Church history, the history of abuse, of interventions against abuse, the relationship between historical moment and the reaction to abuse. So how has that evolved over time? For example, in Europe, we had bishops who were not only the spiritual leaders, but they were also the dukes of the territory. They were the dukes, and they were called dukes. So they were also policing, and not only lay people, but also clergy. And there were prisons for clergy in those territories, run by the bishops or the abbots. So I think historically, the difficulty that we have had in Europe to acknowledge the role of police and attorneys and state legislation has to do with that historical background and backpack. And the fact that many police in Ireland and in Catholic parts of mainland Europe were very hesitant to address things that went wrong in the Catholic Church have also to do with that. It's not only Catholic policemen who were resistant or hesitant, but as such, church was considered something outside, and it considered itself outside. But again, that doesn't come from nothing. There is a history behind it. And this history has created a system in which people, structures, processes, and content come together. Any system has these 4 components. And these 4 components, in their interaction, create a mentality and express itself through attitudes. Church, the people. Pope, the bishops, lay, etc. Structures, bishops, conferences, dioceses, parishes, school, etc. Processes, how we relate to each other. how people are chosen, how they are appointed. Content, gospel, any social teaching, Catholic social teaching, etc. So if we want to really make our contribution also from the theological point of view, we need to address all these four elements. It doesn't solve anything if you just change people. If you don't change the rest will overpower people. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. So you need to address the whole. You can't change everything at the same moment, but each one has his or her role to address any of these four elements. And if more people do that, then mentality changes, then attitudes change, and then the whole system moves on. So how do we conceptualize systemic considerations for the church in the interaction of those elements? Where is the place of victims in that? Which role do the different players have in it? And again, it's not only bishops, it's not only the Pope, it's only the Vatican. Each one has a say in this, in a different way, at a different level, with a different responsibility, yes. But as long as we shy away from our own responsibility, the system won't change. That is also shown by the research on bystanders. Bystanders means I look on, I see that something is wrong, but I don't say anything. And in many parishes, we have loads of evidence that people knew about the abuse. The people in the pew knew about the abuse, but they didn't say anything for various reasons. So do we want to be players or bystanders in theological faculties, seminaries, commissions, in the parishes, families, and schools? And I come back to that point. What about the intercultural and multidisciplinary understanding? Theology today can not only rely on inner theological knowledge. It needs to interact with human sciences critically, because human science is not dogma, is not ex cathedra itself. This science says this. No, sorry. That's too simple. Who has said it, in which context, what does it mean, what are the concepts? No, just saying, I have read this from an eminent scholar. Pardon me? And the question of Aufarbeitung, finally something little German here. Aufarbeitung is a beautiful German word, as many German words are beautiful. So Aufarbeitung cannot be translated, as safeguarding cannot be translated in other languages. So Aufarbeitung means literally working through, but it has six different meanings in German. One is learning from the past. Another is preparing for a better present and future. Another meaning is acknowledging what has happened and just abiding with that. You can read it. It has been translated, an article on Aufarbeitung, but again, the word was impossible to translate. So it is a concilium in a theological journal in 3 languages. But I want to come to a closure again, presenting that icon. As I said, this is the view, the perspective that need to lead us, and the reminder that we are not on our own. We don't do this alone. All those asking questions, all these attempts to flesh out our uncomfortableness, our resistances, our hopes, our desires. Jesus is there. If we feel it, and when we feel it or not, he's there. That is his offer. I will be with you till the end of days. Question is, who is that Jesus for us today? And how does he inspire our faith, our prayer, and our theology? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans. I think so much for us to think about, but I know that there will be people who have some questions or want to make some observations. So if you would like to do that, just put your hand up and we'll get the mic to you. Oh, here's one. I'll start with Sharon and she can get the ball rolling.
Sorry, Hans. This is a question from the front 3 rows who couldn't quite see all your slides. Would it be possible for you to share your slides with us, Hans? Sorry to put you on the spot.
As PDFs, yes.
Yes, wonderful. Because we want to spell it correctly. Thank you, Hans, and thank you so much for your presentation. I think that that is a very long list of challenges that you have brought to us. So that is a comment, but thank you.
Sorry. Oh, hi. Sorry, I've been given. I had my hand up. Sorry, my name's Anne. I have a lot of questions, but one word I missed in the presentation. Sorry, when we're talking about healing. Is the word redress, and survivors I know feel that that's one thing that's been missing in their particular area, that a generosity of spirit in relation to redress. So I'm just I feel like, yeah, there are elements that need to happen along the way.
Yeah, thank you. Of course, as I said before, this is not the definitive answer to everything. Of course, there are. This is what I said at the beginning. These are my reflections at this point. I just want to draw the attention, not only of you, but of all, to the fact that in some places, for some victims, the question of redress is principal. In some places, for some victims, it's not important at all. To the contrary, for some of them, it is not helpful for healing. I give you one example. I know a victim in my country who has received an enormous amount of money for our standard from one diocese. He was abused by a non-clergy in church ministry in a very, very terrible way. This victim got an enormous amount of money recently. And he wrote to me, I have it with me, he said, it didn't help my healing. I say, in my experience, every single victim has a right to voice their own concerns and their own expectations. So therefore, it's part of the healing process for some, for others not. But I take your point.
Hans, could you give us some examples of where you have seen courage on the part of institutions in your travels?
One example I can share is, I don't want to embarrass people there, but the French Bishops' Conference started to address abuse in its midst around the year 2017. Seriously. And they had a meeting in Lourdes of the Assembly of the Bishops, and we spoke about the necessity to work on that and through that. And the committee or commission of the Bishops' Conference at that time decided to commission the work of Aufarbeitung, so working through the cases, but not only focusing on the cases, but for example, they went out and opened listening centers for victims across the country to really get a glimpse of the magnitude of what we are talking about. Plus, they had the courage, and this is the very single place where I know what I know of. They had the courage to commission one part of the overall report to a group of sociologists. And they wanted to find out the prevalence rate, not only in the, another German word, in the Hellfeld, but also in the Dunkelfeld. Now, these are really terms that are used in science. Hellfeld means you know what is out in the light, what is openly accessible. So you have, for example, you have 5,000 victims of abuse in that period of time. This is what you know through testimonies, documents, whatever, news, etc. The dark field, in our case, is 10 times more. This is the estimate in, at least the understanding in our field of work. So for one victim we know about, there are 9 or 10 more. But there was never ever the attempt of a serious sociological investigation into that. And the lady who, she's a professor of sociology at one of the leading Paris universities, she came to see me when they were supposed to present the results to Pope Francis. It must have been probably in 21, at the end of 21. And I remember seeing first the news about the results of the report as a whole, of which that sociological part was only one portion. I saw the news about that in an airport where the big news lines ran, 230,000 victims are in the church in France by clergy, and 330 all in all by church employees. That was the headline. Nothing else about the report was important. That number stuck out. And that number got the people who had done that piece of research in trouble, and they were not received by Francis. Not because of Francis, but probably because of other. So, and people in France, from the Academy of Science, the French Academy of Science, intervened and said this was nonsense, this was bullshit, etc. Okay? So the courage, I had met the president of the commission who came for the ad limina, for the 5 years meeting of the bishops to Rome. And there was a meeting in which I had a side talk with the president of that commission, and he said, before the publication of the results, he said, it will be big. But we want to face it. And they did. So I think it was, in that particular historical moment, it was, let me say, it was a coincidence, providence, whatever. The president of the Bishops' Conference was very much behind it. The previous president had inspired that work. And the 3 or 4 bishops who were in that commission were on it. and they had the courage to present the real picture, which no scientist would be surprised by that. No scientist, I mean, would be, yes, we would be depressed, we would be angry, but not surprised, because this is the numbers we talk about since decades, but nobody's listening. I mean, in this country here, World Health Organization says that 1 in 5 girls is abused sexually. 1 in 5 girls today. Does anybody notice that? Does politics work on that? Really? How much is invested after the Royal Commission in this? Darrell could say a word on that. I mean, these are the numbers we talk about. I mean, this is an epidemic worldwide. This is the situation in the world. And the question is, how do we have the courage as a society and as a church, not only to run behind, but also to lead the way?
Hello everyone. Hello Father Hans. My name's Mary. I work for the Archdiocese of Melbourne, and I just wanted to share with you about a resource that we have available. When you mentioned, Father, about prayer and when was the last time we prayed, and in November last year the Archdiocese had, many of you might have been there, I'm not sure, I wasn't able to go, but we had a liturgy of lament in the Archdiocese in St Patrick's Cathedral and just outside the building. So and it was absolutely beautifully crafted, and all the elements that you touched on about praying for the victims and the secondary victims and the people that work with them, and then for the people of God. Really hit all of those elements, and it is available as a resource on the CAM website. There's an audio of it, and there's also a template, so it can be reused in kind of any other situation that you might find yourselves in. So I just wanted to make people aware that that was available. Thank you.
Thank you.
Got time for one last question. I know the people online are kind of winding up very soon. Got one last question here.
Right, sure. Thank you. Okay, Father, you mentioned something in your talk about the idea of defrocking, that's not a process that always happens, but has happened. I've got a question about that, because there was an instance, there have been instances where some clergy are defrocked and they're not actually guilty of any abuse, or be it sexual or anything else. They're actually, all it was they stood up at the pulpit one Sunday and gave a sermon and preached a few more uncontroversial questions, like doctrinal or theological questions in the church. And they ended up getting, I know an instance of one pastor here in Australia, he actually got defrocked for it, and he wasn't even abused, wasn't even an abuser or anything. And yet there are other instances of actual abusers, like known abusers within the church, pastors, priests, who have not been defrocked, and they have been, yeah. So I just want, I'd like to comment on that.
No, so first, maybe I was not clear enough. What I said about defrocking is that I was talking about in the context of allegations of abuse, sexual abuse, other types of abuse committed by clergy meaning deacons, priests, and bishops. What I said was that defrocking, dismissing from the clerical state, doesn't solve automatically the problem of safeguarding afterwards. That was my point. I didn't talk about in general. But I want to let you know that this was a discussion that we had with Ending Clergy Abuse, an umbrella organization founded in the US representing victims associations of clergy sexual abuse from different parts of the world, including Africa, Latin America, Europe, North America. In June 2024, we had 3 days to to discuss the concept of zero tolerance that goes around, and Pope Francis used it. He used it in different occasions and in different senses. So we discussed for 3 days. We sat together with about 10 from ECA and two from our institute, plus I invited, for example, the then Australian ambassador to the Holy See, Chiara Porro, to attend, to see what, from a government perspective, zero tolerance could mean in view of offending against children, etc. So I want to say that because we had a very intense 3 days, and the end result was published on the webpage of Ending Clergy Abuse, where it says that, of course, the major question is how to get justice, and the next is how to do whatever can be done so that an offender doesn't reoffend. And unfortunately, many people don't understand when a priest is defrocked, so dismissed from the clerical state, there is no control from the side of the church anymore. There is no church authority that can tell him anything. So that doesn't mean that people should not be dismissed. But the question is, how far can, in a certain circumstance, with this situation, with that person, to the best of our capabilities, be made sure that this person doesn't reoffend again? Could be dismissal, no problem, no question. But in some places, that's not the best solution. And in some circumstances, it's not automatically the best solution. So zero tolerance means no contact with youth, no contact in pastoral ministry, etc., with vulnerable groups. But how do you make sure that no abuse is committed afterwards? Other cases of defrocking always relate to specific questions. Sorry, I can't respond to that. I'm not familiar with that. But usually it happens quite in due process, and normally there are also instances where you can challenge the decision, etc.
Father Hans, thank you so much for this morning. I think the real message that I got from today in terms of the challenges, the theological challenges, is really one for me is around stronger spiritual conversion in understanding how deeply important this is in our faith to be able to accompany victims and survivors and what that really means. So thank you for a very stimulating, challenging morning, and we're going to break now. So for those of you online, thank you very much. I want to tell you that we will be, we have recorded this session and we will edit it and